Hello, artists. I am so excited to be back in the studio sharing my process with you. For a period of time, I kind of gave up on my Patreon channel because I didn't have the internet access that I needed way out here in the woods of Washington to upload video content. But we have upgraded our internet, and I'm so happy to say that it's going to be a lot easier for me now. So I'm back, and let's get started. Today I am working on this beautiful scene. It is a scene of the wetlands in my front yard. And this was actually a photo that I took last summer, and it was fairly early in the morning. You can see the sun just peeking through in the reference photo, which I'll also attach so that you can use it for your own painting. I am working on a sheet of Lacarte paper. It's just a 9 by 12, and you can actually see that I'm working on a repurposed piece of paper. I basically just take a bristle brush and take it outside and vigorously rub all of the pigment off of it. You can't get this paper wet. It will dissolve the grit. So you do have to be careful about that. Don't take it outside while it's raining. But once I've got all of that pigment off, I'm happy to start a new piece on a repurposed paper. And in fact, in some ways, I actually prefer working on repurposed paper a lot of the time because it creates sometimes these effects that you can't get if you're working on a fresh piece of paper. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but you can see here that I'm starting in with my darkest darks. I've very loosely laid in my drawing, and now I'm starting in. I generally tend to start when I'm working on a scene like this at the horizon line, and forgive my head being right there. I do fix that in just a little while. When I go back and check out the camera and see that I'm in the way, I correct that. So I won't be in the way for too long. But I'm going in with a very, very dark green. And I'm working in this piece with mostly Terry Ludwig pastel sticks. They really are my workhorse. I have the full set of Terrys, but you don't need the full set of Terry Ludwigs. And I'm happy to, talk with you in a Q&A about my favorite pastels. But just know for here that I'm mostly using those. So I'm really starting by looking at the big shapes. I'm laying in the bones of the painting, of the drawing at this point, really. And to me, looking at the big shapes is part of the most important aspect of a painting. Right now, and you'll see me do this a lot, you'll see me kind of pointing at my painting, and then as I'm constantly referencing my reference photo, which for me is I'm looking at my iPhone over there, and so you can see that I'm working from my darkest darks, and now I'm coming in with a little bit of a lighter value, so a little bit lighter. And if you look at this reference photo, you will see that it's predominantly a warm scene, and I'm going to dramatize that because I don't want my painting to be a perfectly realistic painting. That's not what attracts me to works of art. They're beautiful, but in my works of art, I tend to be more impressionistic, and sometimes I even veer towards the abstract. So if you look at these trees, that, and again, I'm sorry for my head being in the way, it will get better. But if you look at these trees um, in the reference photo, you'll see that they are not only the darkest part of this composition, but they're also the coolest. So that's why I put in a very cool green blue into those fir trees over my darkest dark. And because they're the coolest, I'm going to dramatize that, and you can see now that I'm starting to place some actual fairly pure blue into my trees. Because I'm using a light touch, I'm going to be layering quite a bit. And I can, and I will, go over these trees quite a few times. But by laying in some of that blue now, kind of lays some of the groundwork in for me and helps me remember that I want to keep the interior and especially the outside edges of these trees that are away from the sun cooler. You'll notice now that I'm starting in with some mid-tones in the grass area. I like to work all over the entire painting. At least that's my goal. I'm not always successful with it. As artists, you know that it can be very easy to get tunnel vision and really get stuck in certain areas. And I really try hard, and I really advise you to keep moving around the painting as much as possible, because sometimes you might be stuck on one certain area, and it's really not that bad. You have to take everything in the entire painting, all the components as a whole. And if you get tunnel vision and work too much on one area at a time, you're starting to look at the components of the piece, not as a whole, not at the piece as a whole. So you can see now that I'm starting to put my sky in. If you look a little earlier, I had put a little bit of a very light creamy yellow down where the center of interest will be, and that will basically be the lightest light in the piece. I like to get the lightest light and the darkest dark into the painting as soon as possible, because that way it helps me. Again, it's a bit of a roadmap, and I can say, okay, I know that nothing in the rest of the painting will be going darker than the darkest darks that I put in at the beginning, or lighter than, in this case, that yellow, that very creamy light yellow in the upper left third of the painting where the sun will be peeking through. So I'm starting to carve into the trees. This is negative painting, and it's a very important concept to grasp. I know that when I first started painting, negative painting was a very foreign concept to me, because we're very used to working the way that we see, that individuals see that are not artists, tend to look at the positive shapes. But so much of painting, at least the way that I paint, is about painting around those positive shapes, painting the space in between. And I think once you grasp that, a whole new world opens up in the way that you see, and it really improves your work. You can see that up towards the zenith of the sky, I worked in a much cooler color, and I did sort of a mid to light toned violet blue. And as I'm moving down towards the horizon line, I'm putting in almost a turquoise. Not only is it just a tad lighter, and I will actually, as we continue on with the piece and I layer, go even lighter with that color, but it's definitely warmer. Turquoise is a mixture of green and yellow. And that definitely, at least in the way that I see it, is a warmer color than a violet, which is a blue with a red in it. Color is so subjective. We could color could be, oh my goodness, the temperature of color could be a topic we could talk about infinitely. But maybe another time. Let's move on for now. You can see that I'm continuing now to bring some of that lighter color down into my tree line. I don't want to go too far with this just yet, but as I mentioned earlier, shapes are very important to me. In fact, the shapes of things, so if you wish to think of it as the outside line, if you look at those trees and look at the outside line of the trees, that's more important than the inside of the trees themselves. It's just the way that our eyes see things. As long as you have the shape correct and the value correct, what's happening inside the actual object itself, in this case, discussing the trees, is not nearly as important. But heading back up to the sky for a moment, you can see that I added in a little bit of a violet. And I'm basically doing that just to layer some different colors into the sky to create interest. I'll be doing more of that soon. But you can see here that I'm starting to create some form on the trees. Specifically, I'm looking at light. Around the edge of the tree that I just circled around is where the sun is peeking through. And not only will it get lighter, but it will get warmer because the sun is shining through those trees, those fir branches, and it's going to affect the color. So I would never pick up, in this case, I wouldn't pick up a cool green. I wouldn't pick up a bluish green. I would pick up, and I'm sorry, I'm still getting used to this editing program. So there's a couple of places that I skipped a little more than I wanted to, working into the piece. But you can see here that I've definitely used warmer, almost yellows, very neutral yellows in the edges of that fir, and I'm going back and forth. It's a process of carving out. I'm carving into the sky, and then I'll go back in and carve into the trees. And as long as I use a light enough touch, I can do that quite a few times. Really, a lot of the beauty of pastel is that translucent veil of color that you get with layering. So here you can see that I'm coming back in to some of the areas that are not being hit by the light so much. And I'm looking just as much at the way that the sun is hitting those trees because that really creates the form on the trees. The light creates form. Okay, I'm starting to come in with a new pastel. I enjoy working with new pastels throughout the process. I find that layering them, even on top of soft pastel, much softer pastels, of course they're all soft pastel, but new pastel is harder than, say, the Terry Ludwigs that I've been working with. I enjoy using them, especially for grasses. You'll see me do that quite a bit. But for now, I was just really laying in some of the darks down in the foreground. The foreground will not be as dark as my darkest dark, which are the trees. And I like to think of the entire composition the entire landscape in this case as having at least three values. There's a dark, a mid-tone, and a light. And in this case, the trees are the darkest, the sky is the lightest, and the foreground is the mid-tone. So there's a lot more to that whole concept that we can discuss in future videos. For now, I'm kind of looking at there's a little bit of a differentiation, obviously, between the very foreground of the grasses and what will be some of the flowers that I'm going to put in. And there's the mid-ground, which is what I'm working on right now. That mid-ground in between the tree line and the grasses. And because it's farther back, one way to indicate that is by using a more muted, cooler tone than the grasses that are in the foreground. And because I used that muted, sort of a grayish green mid-tone in that mid-ground, I am also putting it up into some of my trees, because it's always good to, if you're using a certain color, to put it in at least three places throughout your painting, just to create cohesion and balance. So here I am putting it in some of the cooler areas of the trees. I'm using that same color a little bit down there in the corner, you'll see. I like to keep my edges of the picture plane rather soft. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we progress. Just reestablishing some of those dark areas. Always looking at the bones of the piece and reestablishing darks and then working over them again is one way to do that. I like to think of it as, in some ways, you're making the piece with the original darks, and then I'm breaking the piece by going over them, and then I'm making it again by painting yet again over those darks that I just put in to reestablish my roadmap. And that whole concept is something that is rather complex, really, but it's a beautiful way to work. It really lends a lot more complexity to your painting when you do that. Just layering and breaking down and then reestablishing. So you can see that in my grasses now, working in the foreground a little bit, I've created a bit of a path that's not necessarily there when it's not as obvious in the reference photo as it is right now in my painting. Now, it's pretty obvious right now in the painting. I will make it much more subtle as we move forward. But having a path there is integral. It's important for the viewer to have a way into the piece. So if there wasn't a way in, I would imagine one and put it in. I would create that. When you do look at the reference photo, we're lucky in this piece that there is a little bit of a pathway in. So I'm really just exaggerating that. Again, sort of working on that mid-ground. And, in nature, there's not very, very dark darks in general. If you look at a value scale, we're really working, if 1 was, say, the darkest and 10 was the lightest, we're really working in more of a round of a 3 to a 7 scale. So even though I put those very dark darks in, I want to tone them. I want to lighten them up a little bit so that they're not so stark, because that's not really what we see in nature. That's not natural. I do find that as I progress as an artist, I tend to use a more and more limited palette in certain pieces. Sometimes I go all out with color and use just about every color in the box. That tends to be more when I'm working abstractly. But in a piece like this, I try to keep my colors fairly limited. I find that it makes for a more beautiful piece. Here you can see that I'm starting to lay in the base for some of the Queen Anne's lace. And, you know, if you look at the rest of the piece, it's certainly not completed. There's a lot more to go. But as I said earlier, I enjoy and I think that it's important to work the entire piece as a whole and not get too focused on any one area. And so, you know, not only did I put in the base for the flowers for that reason, but also just as, again, as a roadmap, I needed to get them in just to see them. I needed to see them in connection with the whole. And I started those out just, I think observation is so important. I really looked at those flowers in the reference photo and said, you know, what kind of color is that? You know, so to really say that to yourself, what color is that? And to me, it looked like the base of those flowers looked like a cool blue, some kind of a cooler toned neutral blue. So that's what I put in. You can see that I'm working on my grasses and really starting to pump up that color. And now this is interesting, and I do this sometimes. I'm taking a fan brush and I am making it and breaking it. Right here, I'm breaking it. I put in a lot of that color, that bright color, but it was too much. So here's a straight edge razor, and you can see that I'm actually going in and carefully, because I don't want to obviously rip my paper. The paper's pretty tough. But I'm not only removing some of the pastel, but with my mark making and the way that I was scratching into the grass, it was actually creating little pieces of grass with essentially negative mark making. I'm coming up into the sky, and when you look at the reference photo, you can see that there's some clouds. And I haven't fully decided if I want those clouds in my painting or not. I know that I like the brightness and the bit of atmosphere that's peeking through between those two smaller trees. So you can see that I'm putting some of that in. But I'm kind of experimenting at this point. I'm not one for doing a lot of studies or thumbnails ahead of time, although I always would suggest that you do, because it can save you a lot of grief later. But sometimes when you've been painting for a long time, you just want to dive right in and just go straight into the piece. And just from experience, I know that if I don't like something, I can correct it. Pastel's so forgiving that way. It's very easy to go back in and take pieces out that you aren't happy with and just rework them. Coming back into the grasses, I'm starting to work in some of the bottom parts of the picture plane, which I don't want to call attention to. So not only is it a cooler, darker green down there, but having it be a little cooler and darker will not want, we won't want our eye will not want to naturally travel there. which is good. I want to keep the viewer in the pathway. I want them to follow the painting as I'm creating it, which is through the path up to the flowers. Then you'll come up into that real focal area of the sun shining through the trees. And then hopefully I'll create enough interest in that sky area, maybe with some clouds or even just variations of color in the sky to lead your eye back down into the painting and around. So in some ways, I really look at this composition as a circular composition. Starting back in building up a little bit of the flowers and working again, not sticking into one place for too long. So there is my new pastel coming back in and working on the edge of it. The pastels have so many different ways that we can utilize them. You can see now I'm drawing with it like a pencil almost, and very, very loosely holding it in my hand and creating little grass marks. Starting to blur out that dark pathway that I've created, because again, I don't want it to be an obvious pathway. I don't even want it particularly to be recognized as a path. I just want a place for the eye to come into the painting. So I want to blur it out and really make it cohesive with the rest of that foreground. Just looking at some of the foliage in the foreground area there and dramatizing it, if you look at the reference photo, it's green. It looks greener than what I'm putting in, but into my painting. But I don't want the entire painting to be all greens. That would be boring. And so I can break up some of the green with orange, burnt oranges. Here, that's a violet. Putting in some grasses, some of those tall grasses with more of a violet and orange tones. Starting to warm up some of the flowers, some of those Queen Anne's lace. As I get lighter, I'll go warmer on those to show that the sun is hitting them. And again, around the edges of the painting, I really want to make those soft edges. I don't want the eye to go there. It's almost like a vignetted effect to help draw the eye into the painting, not around the edges. And here you can see that I'm taking my finger and taking an edge of those flowers and just pulling it out. And that's going to help break edges. What we call lost and found edges, which is such an important concept in painting. Again, I'm looking, I'm really observing, and at this point, nearing the end of this fairly quick piece, stepping back a lot. You're not seeing that because I've edited that out to keep this video at a manageable amount of time so that you don't get too bored. But I do step back quite frequently and take a look at what's going on. It's the best way to see it as a whole. I can't see it as a whole when I'm up so close to it. So really at that point you can see that I'm looking around and I'm thinking about my circular composition. Thinking about does it read correctly? Am I moving the viewer around the way that I want to? Here I'm not quite happy with the shape of that tree, so I'm coming in with some of that sky color and very quickly, not going in closely like with a pencil and really meticulously trying to carve. That doesn't work. It's going to look stilted. I'm going in and tapping and trying to just create a natural form on that tree. Closing in on the end of the piece now, I'm taking some of that initial very warm, almost orangey yellow that I had initially placed up in that sunny area of the sky, and I'm starting to include some of that in the foreground and the flowers. Because I used it up in the sky, I want to use it in other areas of the painting. You can see there that one of those little grass blades I created I didn't like, so I just simply rubbed it out with my finger. I like blending sometimes with the new pastels on top of the soft pastels. It just creates this beautiful haze of color. So we're really just about at the end of this painting, doing a few more little finishing marks here and there. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm so excited to be back with you guys. I can't wait to upload content. We'll have at least 2 demos a month, but I'll probably honestly put in a lot more than that just because I paint daily and I love to paint, and might as well just record what I can for you guys and share it with you. Please feel free to comment. Let me know what you thought about this. Let me know what you'd like to see in the future. I'm planning on showing and sharing with you everything from wildlife to florals to still life figures, abstract, more abstracted landscapes, everything under the sun. Just final touches there in my center of interest. Stepping back, adding some little bits of interest to my flowers. So I hope you all enjoyed this tutorial. Again, I'm excited to share a lot more with you in the future, and I will see you soon.